All right, everyone. Good to be with you all. So it is 2 days before Christmas. You're probably not watching this until it's mm, January 9th or 10th or 11th, something like that. But right now it is December 23rd. Um, and I'm enjoying my break. It's great. I'm working a little bit, but not too hard. So we did the Wild West last time. Now we are starting on the lecture that's entitled Second Industrial Revolution. So let me go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see the PowerPoint. Um, so the industrialization comes to America at a different time period than it does to our various European counterparts. Remember, it first starts in Britain in the 1750s when the steam engine is invented. Then it's going to spread to continental Europe, to Belgium, northern Germany, France, the Scandinavian countries, and to the United States. A bit later than it does to these other countries. The U.S. always had this notion that at least half of the country, the Jeffersonian half, um, this is what Republican agrarianism was all about, was resisting industrialization, because it seemed like this nearly irresistible force that was sweeping Europe, that it was a new phenomenon, factories, factory owners, and the proletariat workers to, come inside the factory and do the labor. This is totally different than the U.S. Uh, experience, which prided itself on yeoman farmers. Each individual, nearly everybody, could afford to own their own plot of land and work on it, and the land would produce not only food, but water and all of the things necessary for consumption. I mean, a few things here and there you'd go by. But the U.S. really actively resisted this. Republican Party didn't like the national bank and the tariff and all of the elements that go along with it. Yet still, industrial revolution comes. The northern part of the country, which was the more populous part, really jumped in the deep end and embraced it with two arms and said, yes, this is a wonderful thing. This will bring us progress and technology and all the rest of it. Civil War was kind of the proving ground that it would be superior to a slavery system in every way, and there's no hiding it. After the war, slavery was revealed as not nearly as dynamic and adaptable a system, but capitalism was. And then when we move into the post-Civil War era, historians usually chunk this into a new time period known as the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, you could just say it was one long wave that really started in the early 1800s with the steam engine, 1807 with steamships, and then spinning looms in 1814, and then canals, being dug and transported. Second National Bank in 18. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it. 1817, I think, is when Madison is going to renew it. 1816. In any case, you could look at it as one long era, but historians usually chunk it into both. Sometimes they call the period before the Civil War, they'll refer to it as the market revolution. And then this one in the last quarter of the 19th century, they'll call it the industrial revolution. Sometimes it's the first industrial revolution and the second. A lot of the similar elements. This time around, we're not going to get a national bank. We don't have a national bank until 1913. With the Federal Reserve Act. But the US had really conquered the unstable currency system that plagued us in the first half of the 19th century. Notice that the debates over the national bank don't go anywhere after Jackson kills the second national bank, and that's largely because of the gold rush. Because we lacked the precious metal foundation to have a stable currency, but with all the gold and silver coming out of California and Nevada, the US government buys up most of it, and then other banks can hold it in reserve, and that stabilized the currency for a long period till 1913. So the debates over the national bank don't go anywhere, but the tariff debates heat up again, very much so. And we're going to build fewer and fewer steamships and more railroads, as you can see in the foreground of this picture in the slide. Beautiful thing about railroads is that canals and rivers freeze over in the wintertime. You can use the railroads 12 months of the year. So, something you probably didn't think about living in California, but if you, not the Mississippi River, but certain canals that were dug, like the Erie Canal, they freeze over in December and you can't use them for 2 or 3 months. Doesn't happen with railroads. Railroads also go faster. Railroads, the first ones come about in the late 1830s, but they don't really get going until after the Civil War. A lot were built before, but still steamships and canals and riverways were the preferred method of transportation. Now, in what we'll call the Gilded Age, railroads start to replace canals and every other method of travel because they were safe, they were convenient, they were easy. And they change a lot of stuff that you probably wouldn't even think about. For instance, you probably know we have 4 major time zones in the US and the contiguous part of the country. We have Alaska divided into like 4 time zones, and Hawaii's way out in the middle of the Pacific. But other than that, we got 4, right? We got Pacific Standard, we got Mountain, we got Central, we got Eastern. That used to not be the case. In fact, talk about complicated. You would buy an almanac, and then every day they would tell you essentially like when sunrise and when sunset was, and you would set your watch to sunrise and sunset, basically. And this made for a nightmare. Like Boston and New York City were 18 minutes apart, actually, because they had slightly different sunrise and sunset. They're not the same latitude. This made it an absolute nightmare for railroad lines to figure out when you were departing and when you were arriving. And, now it's still a little confusing, but not nearly the mess it was before. So almost overnight during the Gilded Age, the US government came in and said, we're going to divide the country into time zones. And that way, if you leave Boston at X hour and arrive at New York, you're within the same time zone and it's not as confusing. One of these interesting examples where actually government can improve the economy, quite often from libertarians or even conservatives, they would argue just as an axiomatic fact that government can't improve the economy. All it does is get in the way. All it does is ruin efficiency. That's clearly not the case. Now, it is true. It can, and it frequently does ruin those things. But this is an example where just a totally unregulated market is disastrous, and government can come in with laws and improve the market. So the Gilded Age, let's talk about this for a second. This is the name of this period. I'll lay my cards on the table and tell you this is not my favorite era of US history. It's probably my least favorite. Now, there's a lot of interesting things happening, but honestly, this period is a bit of a regression in American history. It's the one time period in US history where life expectancy actually decreased as a whole. In the countryside, it improved, but in the cities, it went way down, and so that offset it for the whole country. I'm sorry to say that in a lot of ways, we could argue we're living through a second Gilded Age now, because life expectancies actually decreased the last 4 or 5 years. This is because of the proliferation of opioid drugs, alcoholism, things like that. Now, it hasn't gone down drastically, but it was, I'm making these up slightly, but I know it was 78 years with some remainder, so it was like 78.7, and each year it went down like a tenth of a year, right? So like, 78.7 to 0.6 to 0.5, et cetera. It's not drastically dropping, but it is dropping, which is alarming. You always expect as an economy grows, as society progresses, that life expectancy increases. Occasionally you have backslides in major wars or epidemics. Well, in the last 5 years, even before the pandemic, life expectancy was decreasing, obesity rates, et cetera. This is largely a function of the inequality in the US. It's a very weird phenomenon, but the US is simultaneously the richest country on earth by far, and has the highest poverty rates by far, which you're like, how is that possible? It's a paradox. It's because it's so unequal, right? Is that there's a handful of very wealthy people that control most of the wealth in the country, and then we have huge numbers of people who are homeless, and just the working poor. There's a lot of people in the US who have jobs. You can envision, a married couple where husband and wife both work at Walmart full-time and still can't afford to pay their rent and to buy groceries, so they need assistance from the government. This is straight out of the Gilded Age of the last quarter of the 19th century. So the period that follows Reconstruction, 1876 to 1900, that 25-year period there, is called the Gilded Age. Mark Twain coined this. He wrote a novel in that era and called it the Gilded Age. Now, I've never read it, but from what I understand, it's not a very good novel, but it was very appropriate for the time period. So the very name gilded means gold plated. So it's like shiny and sparkling, but if you actually chip it away with a knife or other instrument, you find out it's just worthless lead underneath. And that was an accurate name for the title. There were so many exciting breakthroughs in the Gilded Age, but how much could like regular average Americans actually enjoy these things? So just a few of these things that come out at the time. This is probably the most drastic time period of change, it's certainly in the US, maybe even in the world, than anybody had ever seen before. I have lived through a huge change in the way that we live our lives. You guys have lived post that change, so you probably don't even notice it. You have grown up in a world where it's very normal to have these magical devices in our pockets that can answer any question that you have. If I could tell you guys how I grew up, I probably share much more in common with the way my parents grew up in the 1950s than with you guys. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s, which was 30, 40 years later, but still, the basic technology was largely the same. Telecommunications meant television and telephones. We didn't have cell phones when I was growing up. We had regular phones. Most of my growing up, life, my adolescence, I didn't have cordless phones. Phones were like in the kitchen, stationary. We had one line for the whole house. And just looking back at that now, it's totally crazy. If you were sitting, with your friends on a summer day and you got into a debate about, anything, who won the World Series in its particular year, or, what episode of Star Trek was in what season, there was nobody to solve that debate for you. There was no, area where you could just go and find it. You couldn't just Google things, My dad and mom were Google. I just have to ask them like, hey, Dad, who won the World Series in '84? I'm not sure. I had a debate with my friend. Nowadays, we live in this revolutionary period where information's at your fingertips. It really is extraordinary. It's changed a lot of stuff. Even that pales in comparison to the Gilded Age. Life was changing at a rapid pace, the likes of which no one has ever seen before or since. And transportation and communication and trade, everything changed and everything exploded. First, we have the telephone. Now, the telegraph, which we didn't even really talk about yet, that was revolutionary. In 1845, an American, Samuel F.B. Morse, invented the telegraph, which really was just a device where you could send pulses through copper lines, through cables. Now, most people didn't have telegraph lines. They were pretty much monopolized, owned by Western Union and other, private, companies. AT&T actually stands for American Telephone and Telegraph. It's that old. And you would pay these companies to send messages, essentially. So let's say you live in Baltimore, you want to send a message to your auntie who lives in San Francisco. You'd write out the message. They would charge you a certain amount of money per letter, a penny a letter, or 5 cents a letter. I don't know what it was, but that's how you did it. And they would then type out that message through Morse code, through a series of dots and dashes, to another clerk on the other side of the country. And they would then receive the message, translate it into English, and then write it down and then put it in a little box. And then your auntie would go and check the Western Union office once a week or once a month to get her messages. But you could send a message, like a full letter, in a matter of 5 minutes or so. Now, that seems ridiculous to us today. We can send and receive information instantaneously from around the world. This was a huge breakthrough. 1845, this was the first time ever where you could separate out a physical message from its actual physical reality, right? From the message itself. And here's what I mean, is that you had to send a physical letter across the ocean or across a continent. Now you could just send it with wires. After the Civil War, right after the Civil War, just a few months, the US partnered with Britain to lay a transatlantic cable, which I think it's mind-boggling. And every time I say it, I said, that can't be true. It's impossible. It's the way they did it. They took a long cable, 3,000 miles long, and they just wound it up thousands of times onto a huge ocean-going vessel, and then they hooked one end of it up in New York, and then they started sailing for London, and they just sort of dropped the cable into the ocean the whole way, hooked it up in Great Britain, and it worked. And the cable was just at the bottom of the ocean, and that's how it worked. Sounds ridiculous, sounds crazy, but that's how it worked. Once the telephone comes out in 1876, they do the same thing, and now you can call instantaneously. But in reality, who was using these incredibly expensive inventions? Government and companies, basically. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, these incredibly wealthy people would call to get information, from these other places. If you ever go to Hearst Castle in Central California in San Simeon, you can see William Randolph Hearst lived on this, mountaintop essentially in Central California. He could pick up a phone and call his businesses all over the world. Americans didn't have phones in their homes until really the teens and 20s, is when people in cities who were middle class had phones. It doesn't become a staple where like everybody in America has it till really the early 20th century. But it came out, and it was mind-boggling. And people go to the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, our 100-year birthday in 1876, and they wait in line over an hour to pick up a phone and talk to someone on the other side of the fair, and it was amazing. It was actually quite funny. Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone, and he imagined that the whole method of talking on it would be very formal, and he had spent some time in the Navy, and so he had this bizarre method of greeting people on the phone, which you're supposed to do on ships on the high seas, where if you are talking to someone else and you don't know who it is, you would pick up the phone, it would ring, you'd pick up the phone, and you would say, "Ahoy hoy." This is what you do on ships as well through a big bullhorn. You don't know who you're talking to. And then the other person would respond, "Ahoy." I love that. I want you guys to bring it back, by the way. Like if you are texting your friend and you don't know if they have their phone on them or whatever, I don't know what you guys say. You say, "Sup, you awake," whatever. So I want you to replace that. Do it tonight. Freak people out. Say ahoy hoy. It's spelled A-H-O-Y, and then the second word is H-O-Y. Ahoy hoy. It's amazing. Bring it back. It never caught on. People were just like, "What? What are you talking about? I'm not in the Navy. I'm going to pick up the phone and say, 'Hello, who is this?'" And this is kind of what our formal lexicon has become over the phone. In any case, transformative. You don't need an actual individual to study Morse code for 6 months to send messages. You could just talk over the phone, which is just absolutely extraordinary. By the way, what was an even longer line, the longest line at the Centennial Exposition, was a line to see, wait for it, a banana, which I find just extraordinary. People waited in line 4 hours to see an actual banana like under a glass case because they had never seen one before. You guys probably know you buy bananas, they're good for like 3 or 4 days, right? It's like, oh, they're green, they're green, they're green. Oh, they're yellow, we better eat them all. And then 2 days later, they're like jet black and they're too sweet and mushy, right? This is what happens. So you could not take bananas from these tropical places in Indonesia or Ecuador and ship them up to America. They'd be rotten by the time they got there. They didn't have these pressurized containers that would be airtight, that would seal it and keep it at cold temperatures, which prevents it from ripening too quickly. They didn't have any of that. All of a sudden, this comes out. It's very expensive and it's very costly, but this would improve American diets. I think I told you guys before, most Americans did not eat fruit. In fact, you'd add it a few months a year, September, October, November, when the harvest comes in, people would eat apples. Apples grow almost anywhere in America. And that was it. Then you'd preserve jams and jellies for the rest of the year for your sweets, to get a little roughage. If you study like ancient medicines before the 20th century, not even ancient, but just sort of, 19th century medicines, most of the medicines were anti-constipation medicines. They were like laxatives because people were constipated all the time because they weren't eating roughage. They weren't eating fruits and vegetables because they rotted too quickly. You grew your own vegetables, but that wasn't a wide array of a wonderful diet. It was just, corn mainly, that was all you could really grow on your own. And it's really a starch, not a vegetable either. And so this would improve diets. This was wonderful. Again, it doesn't really become available for most Americans to have for several decades later, right? The first computers came out in the 30s and 40s, but people don't have them in their homes till the 1980s. And even then, you know, I remember the first person on our block to get a computer in 84, 85, and you know, it was a Commodore 64. All it could do was word processing and spreadsheets, and that was it. That's all it could do. A few games, right? And it was $4,000. And so most of us didn't have them until the 90s. And now everybody's got them, and they're cheap, and they've changed our lives. So it takes time for this stuff to happen. Mass production. Oh, real quick, steel. Steel underwent a revolution. This was not something that originated out of the US. The British did it in the 1870s, and then we stole their technology and did it even better. Henry Bessemer invented a process to cut down the time to make steel. Steel is iron infused with carbon. And so he invented a blast furnace to kind of blow iron in, or blow carbon into the iron at very hot temperatures, and it just cut down the time period to make steel. It used to be very hard, like blacksmiths would have to work for weeks and months to make a single piece of steel. And now you could do it unskilled, with unskilled laborers who didn't even know English. Most of these workers would be Polish or Lithuanian or other Eastern European, and drastically increase the amount of steel the US could produce. Plus, the US has the largest iron and coal reserves in the world. And so we had that. We could just take all those materials out of Colorado and Montana and ship them to the steel mills in Chicago and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And we were on a roll. We could produce more steel than everybody else. By the 1890s, the US is producing more steel than every other country on earth, which is the measure of an economy at that point. Remember how it was cotton in the 1850s? By the 1870s, it's steel. And by the 1890s, the US produces the most on earth of anybody. We build the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Now you don't have to walk to California anymore. The whole country is linked together by this railroad network. It was great. By 1900, the US produces 1 out of every 3 goods on the planet. This would fluctuate over the next 100 years. At the end of World War II in 1945, that would be 1 out of every 2 things on the planet was made in the US. Nowadays, it's about 1 out of every 4 or 5 things. It's about 22% or so, which is still highly productive for a country that's only 4% of the world's population. And so this was extraordinary. The US could produce this much stuff. What were our major industries? We produced most of the world's railroads. In fact, most of the countries in Latin America, the US built their railroads, went into those countries and did it, mostly to extract the wealth, right? That Rockefeller would go down and buy up oil fields all over Mexico, and he'd say, I can't get the oil out. I need these big, cars constructed to transport the oil out, railroad cars, and I need to lay all this railroad. So you go to Cornelius Vanderbilt and he lays it all for you. The US produced most of the cigarettes in the world, still do. Not a great thing, but it's a huge moneymaker. US produced most of the soap, furniture, cloth, wheat, animal and vegetable fats. This is the time period when most Americans are still using lard to cook with. Very unhealthy. We don't really do it anymore. We use, butter or margarines. Margarine is invented in America in the late 19th century, and it takes off, like wildfire. And of course, automobiles, which this is before Henry Ford. The British invent the automobile in the late 1800s. The US again steals the technology and improves upon it. Again, not so much with quality, but with quantity. Again, a US car is not considered the best in the world. The Europeans make very fine ones. But we just drown the world in volume, and it's a lot cheaper just to buy an American car. So this was wonderful. However, there were some very bad things that went along with all of this. Real quick, before I get to the bad things, I forgot to mention, one of the huge phenomena coming out of this is electricity. Thomas Edison and the light bulb. The film projector is that now you have not just still shots, but you actually have films you can go to. In the 1890s, silent movies came out and people went in and watched them, which was, the accounts are amazing. The first people that went inside a movie theater and watched it, it was like a train coming at the screen, and a lot of people screamed and ran out of the theater. They thought it was real. They had never seen a moving picture before, which is rather extraordinary. Edison invented direct current, batteries, all this technology. And then we have this immigrant from Hungary here. We have Nikola Tesla, who invented alternating current, and they got in kind of this duel with each other, trying to outdo one another. Edison was really the more famous one. As a child, I had never heard of Tesla. The first time I had ever even heard of him was from the 2006 movie, The Prestige, which was a really good Christopher Nolan movie. David Bowie played him in the movie. And then he just exploded in popularity. People sort of rediscovered Nikola Tesla, and they went back and said, wow, this guy was the greatest inventor of all time. And then so now you have a whole division of Elon Musk's, company that he calls Tesla, and all our electric cars are called that, etc. So now people don't have electricity in their homes unless they're super rich, but businesses do. Electricity replaces steam. Think about this. If you are in a spinning loom factory in 1815, you must have a steam engine in there. So someone's literally shoveling coal into a big steam engine, which is very hot and smoky and loud and dangerous. They explode all the time. And now this whole operation has moved to the city outskirts, where someone's shoveling coal in there, it's true, and you are now creating huge amounts of heat. The heat is, creating steam, but the steam is pushing pistons that will now charge batteries and send electrical current along wires. When you're actually in the factory, you just flip a light switch, and silently everything hums quietly. So factories like that, by the 1880s and 1890s, start to convert one at a time to electricity because it's safer, cheaper. You don't have smoke right inside the factory, explosions, heat, all that stuff. You have electricity doing it, which was wonderful. So all of this is great, right? Well, what are the negative trends? Number one, monopolization. Is that this was a trend that started in the Civil War and then accelerated later, where small independent manufacturers just can't compete. I mean, these factories in the 1820s in New England, there were dozens of them, and they all competed against each other, which is good for market competition. What happened over time is the big guy swallowed the little guy, and over and over again, to the point where there were these huge monopolists that just controlled 80, 90, 100% of the industry in the US. They could set prices at whatever they wanted, and you had to pay it. And they didn't really get this through honest competition. It was a lot of bribery, threats, intimidation, etc. And there were no anti-monopoly laws. The US today has anti-monopoly laws, but we largely ignore them, and we just let these huge corporations buy up other ones. That's why we have phenomena like Walmart buying out their competitors, Facebook, etc. I guess Facebook now owns Instagram, and so it's like, geez, right there you have two of the biggest social media companies. What else is there? Twitter. I don't know what else you guys are on, but young people use it, not the older generations. Time Warner Cable, etc., Viacom, Disney, these giant companies buy up the smaller ones, and that's kind of the norm today. Again, this trend, we're kind of in the second Gilded Age. That originated in the Gilded Age in 1876 to 1900. Probably the most prototypical one was Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller became, of the robber barons, the richest robber baron. He started in Pennsylvania in the 1860s. Petroleum was known. It bubbles to the surface in various areas. They knew that it was flammable. But again, as late as the 1860s, people used whale oil to light their homes with lamps. It was just cheaper and easier to extract. It was a known thing. It had been used for centuries. But petroleum was very available in the US, huge quantities of it. And then they figured out how to refine it. And then Rockefeller used his profits there to buy up oil fields all over the US, Texas and Oklahoma. Then he went to Mexico and bought up all of theirs. And then he just completely monopolized the industry. There's two types of monopolies. There's vertical integration and there's horizontal combination. Horizontal combination is when you buy out your direct competitor, right? It would be if Chevron bought out Shell and then ExxonMobil and then Arco, and then it's like, okay, there's just one huge gasoline company. Vertical integration is when you try to synthesize all methods of production. So that would be, you own a lot of these oil companies today, they don't own the oil fields to extract the oil. They buy the crude oil from Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, and then they bring it in, and then they refine it, and then they go and they sell it. Sorry, my gardener's outside. I don't know if you can hear the leaf blower, but it's a little distracting. So if you vertically integrate, you would then buy the oil field, extract it. You would own you would own the companies that drill it and suck it out of the ground. You would own, you know, you would make your own barrels to transport it, your own, you know, pipelines, etc. You would do all of that. For instance, McDonald's. When I was a kid, McDonald's would buy meat from meat companies, from competitors, and then they would then, you know, convert it into hamburgers and sell it. They then in the 90s started to go to Brazil and like cut down huge areas of rainforest and raise their own cattle. So they control every mode of production so that they can keep their costs down. Same thing with their potatoes. They actually bought huge amounts of land in Idaho so they could grow their own potatoes. It's a different kind of monopolization, and there aren't many laws to prevent it, but it's kind of bizarre and alarming, right? Think of Disney. Disney owns this is known as a conglomerate, where it's not just one area of a business, it's multiple different things. Disney started off as a, you know, film studio, right? 1937, they made Snow White. And then he made another movie and another movie, another movie. And then he started making theme parks in the 50s. And then they started, you know, they own now TV station. They own ABC and Disney Channel and all this other stuff. They have their own streaming service. They make their own films, right? They have their own movie production companies, multiples of them. They make plush toys and all kinds of other things, merchandise that you can buy. It's this huge monster that's made, you know. That is conglomerization in its essence, or monopolization. In the 1890s, they did try to fight against it a bit. The Sherman Antitrust Act came out to try to prevent that. They said if a business controls more than 51% of a certain industry, the government can come in and break them up. Or if you want to merge two big industries, you would need authorization from the US government, from the Commerce Department. And this law is basically ruled out of existence practically. It's never struck down, but the Supreme Court interprets it in such a narrow way that each time that it's used, you know, corporations can hire very clever lawyers that then can, you know, read it and find loopholes in the law and say, well, no, we don't qualify as a monopoly because of XYZ, whatever reason. And ironically, businesses that weren't monopolies would then go to the courts and say, hey, this union that's really causing me problems at my business, they are the monopoly because they control all the labor in this town, right? Everyone who works in my steel mill is in this union, and I can't find any labor without going through the union. So they're the monopoly, not me. And it's like, wait, poor immigrant laborers are the monopoly and Rockefeller and Carnegie are not? Yeah, so says the Supreme Court, basically. So this was America during this particular time period. The wealth gap got immense. I want you to think about this for a moment. Without Googling, without looking, can you name me a president after Grant? And even Grant might be hard, right? Like if I say after Lincoln, but let's say after Grant, because he leaves office in 1877. So after Ulysses Grant and before Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, can you think of one? It's very hard, right? These people are no-name presidents. There's almost no achievements that they, you know, brought about. They're not the worst presidents in American history, which you would at least remember them if they were the worst. They're just sort of middle of the road caretaker presidents that came in and didn't ruffle anyone's feathers. Why is that? Because power really gravitated away from government at this time period, and businesses were all powerful. Not unlike today, right? Is that we find that really true power is not always in the hands of government. It's in these huge telecoms, right? Think of all the super powerful people in America that are very rich. You got, you know, Zuckerberg at Facebook. You got Jack Dorsey over at Twitter. You've got Roger Ailes at Fox News, Ted Turner at CNN. They can control the media, basically. Almost everything we see is through these people. Think of, you know, the Walton family who runs Walmart, the Koch brothers who run Koch Industries, the largest petroleum manufacturer in the US. Conservatives really don't like George Soros. He's a very liberal banker and he donates a lot of money to liberal causes. These people wield tremendous power in the US today, just like the robber barons of the past. Now, can you name a robber baron of 1876 to 1900? You should be able to. I already named a few of them for you, but here's who they were. So you have John D. Rockefeller. He was in the oil business. Cornelius Vanderbilt, and then all of his sons for several generations. He was in the railroad industry. Leland Stanford, another one in, you might have heard of him, big one in California. He was in the railroad industry as well. Andrew Carnegie, who ran most of the steel mills in the United States. We know these people because they were rich, they were powerful, and they were egomaniacs, and they built huge monuments to themselves all over this country, and their names are still on them. If you go to New York, you have Rockefeller Center, Rockefeller Plaza, right? It's a big like outdoor skating rink where this time of year in December you can go and skate. They have a big Christmas tree, and it's this beautiful area to congregate in Midtown Manhattan. You have Carnegie Hall, which is a huge opera house that Andrew Carnegie built to himself. You have Stanford University, right? Leland Stanford. I love the story of Stanford. If you guys don't know this, Leland Stanford was this guy who built the Transcontinental Railroad, became a multi-millionaire, was governor of California for a bit. And very tragically, his son died. I think his son was like 12 or 13, died tragically. Don't ask me how, I don't really know. But Stanford was very troubled by this, very depressed. And in the spirit of the times, he wanted to give back to his community, he wanted to give money. So he went to the University of California, which back then was just Berkeley. That was it. Berkeley, 1868 with the University of California. We didn't have the whole UC system that we do now. So he wrote a check and he said, I want to donate this to you, but all I want is a little statue of my son right outside of a building that I will also name after my son. And Berkeley told him to take a hike. They said, we do not do that. We get most of our funding from the state, and we don't want rich people to just give money to our campus and control it. So take a hike, Stanford. So Stanford said, I will build my own university, and it will be better than Berkeley and even better than Harvard. And damned if he didn't do it. No offense to Berkeley, it's a very fine institution, but Stanford's up there. It's technically not in the Ivy League, but it's better than some of the Ivy League, better than UPenn, I would say. Maybe not as good as Yale or Harvard, but not far off. Certainly as good, if not better than Princeton, I would say, or Dartmouth. It's a fantastic university. And one guy, not the government, a man wrote a check and created that university with the huge endowment that it has. And because he had total control, it's got a super creepy vibe if you've ever been on the campus, because you'll go, oh, there's a little dead boy. Oh, there he is again. Oh, there he is again. He's all over the place. He's like, if you watching The Conjuring or something like that, this little boy that had died a century ago, but his spirit is everywhere on that campus. So that's the story of Stanford University. So, other very bad phenomenon during this time period was working conditions. They were terrible. They were worse than they had ever been. Now, America had some awful institutions before, like slavery. But for free people who worked, this was far worse than we had ever experienced before. Remember that, it would be young girls who would go off and work in a cotton mill for a few years out of their lives, and then they become mothers, and that was it. Immigrants would do some of the hard labor in America, but most people still farmed, and most people could pick your own hours. That's one of the great things about owning your own farm. You don't have to work 16 hours a day every day. It is a lot of work, but if you're sick, you could take a day or two off, and the fields aren't going to totally disintegrate in that time period. It's very different working in an industrial era where no one set up the rules. No one had said, well, 8 hours a day. Nobody had said 40 hours a week. Nobody said, well, you will make a certain wage, and then beyond 40 hours, you make time and a half or double time. And if you get injured on the job, you can sue none of those laws existed at all. And nobody had any idea how it should look. It was just brand new. It's like, oh, I'll have a factory, you come in and I'll pay you. Often it wasn't even per hour, it was per part. So if you were working a long day, but not working very hard, you wouldn't get as much. They pay you by the piece a lot of time. And so it was brutal. It was brutal. They just modeled it after the farm, system. Basically, they said, well, you work sun up to sundown on a farm, so we'll do that in the factory as well. And then they had electrical lighting, and they're like, well, now you can work even longer than that. And so it was beyond brutal. The average workday was about 14 hours. Some people work 16 or 18 hours. Average work week was 6 to 6.5 days. You wouldn't even have Sundays off. You'd work a half day, 6 or 8 hours on a Sunday, and that was a half day. It was brutal. And you might say, how on earth did people live like that? Well, the answer is that life expectancy was a lot shorter. You would work until basically you dropped dead. There was no retirement back then. There was no Social Security. Only like rich people would retire. Middle class and the poor largely worked until they dropped dead, which was probably at 62 or 58, if you were lucky. It was unbelievably harsh. Unbelievably harsh. Again, this is why life expectancy decreased, because these factories were all in cities because you need population. And at this time, medicine was in its infancy. We understand what germs are in the late 19th century, but we have really no way to prevent them. Very few vaccinations existed. Medicine was primitive. There weren't even hospitals in major cities until the teens and 20s of the 20th century. And so you'd have epidemics every single year. Every single year, there would be a major epidemic that would wipe out 1%, 2%, 5% of a city's population. The only reason cities didn't out and out disappear was that people kept arriving every day. From the interior of the US, people who moved out west and tried to be a grain farmer and failed, they would then, show up and work at a factory in Cleveland. But also immigrants fresh off the boat from Europe would walk into those factories as well. Unskilled laborers, by and large, would do this. And it was just harsh beyond belief. Wages were very low. Studies have been done that show that if you took what it actually took to live back then and you looked at salaries weren't high enough to actually live. So what did people do? They took in boarders. You would have, people renting out a spot on your floor, and they would pay you a couple of dollars a week to do that, to supplement income. Housewives would do a lot of stuff that today we would say is pretty gross, but they had to. Like they would say, well, we don't have enough money to buy meat, so I'm going to raise rabbits and chickens myself in my own home and slaughter them for food. Thank goodness we don't have to do this anymore. It's not very much fun. A lot of times you'd have to make your own soap, which involves like butchering a hog to get the grease and then buying, raw chemicals to make it. So you use that soap very sparingly. People didn't bathe very often. Before the 20th century, most people bathed once or twice a year, usually in the springtime. You would kind of take what I call like a hobo shower, like nowadays we have wet wipes, but you would take like a rag and dip it in water, and then you would just kind of wipe parts of your body down, but you wouldn't like actually get in a bath or take a shower or anything. Most people didn't have running water. Rich people did in the late 19th century. Middle-class people even did in big cities, but they didn't have whole sewage systems until really the turn of the 20th century. Most cities in America get sanitation between 1895 and 1907. That right there virtually ended all of the epidemic diseases, waterborne diseases like cholera that really plagued major American cities. Other than vaccinations, the toilet is the greatest invention that human beings ever created to prevent disease. And it makes sense, right? Going to the bathroom in an outhouse, especially in like an overcrowded city where you use a chamber pot and you just throw it out into the streets. Filthy, disgusting, disease-ridden, and stinky. I can't imagine how bad it must have smelled back then. Hopefully I'm selling you guys on the point that this is a really awful period of time. I know you see it in movies. You're like, oh, look at those beautiful Victorian gowns and everything. Oh, I wish I lived then. No, you don't. The really rich, their lives were nice, but probably not as nice as an average person living today in America. It was a stark existence for most Americans back then. So, very, very hard times, very difficult. And in the US, we particularly needed immigrants. Remember that this is our unique situation. Other countries were sort of overpopulated. They had lots of poor peasants who had no access to any land of their own or any hope. They pulled their own population into factories to industrialize. The US did not have the numbers to meet the job demand that we had. And so we opened the floodgates. Immigration, by and large, there was no national laws about immigration, which is just astonishing. It was largely determined by factors of supply and demand. Big shipping companies that recruited people, immigrants largely, and said, come to America. And they ferried people back and forth across the Atlantic. They largely determined who would come into the US and who wouldn't. And if a job market dried up, if it was, the mid 1890s, the mid 1870s in a recession, immigrants would stop coming. States determined citizenship and who could vote. And this stuff doesn't really change until when we get into the 20th century, especially the 1920s. And so lots of immigrants. This is the age of Ellis Island, which we'll talk about a little later. Now, going on to the next one. I love this little contrast here. If you have the slides, take a look at them. This here on the top is called the Biltmore. It's in North Carolina. It is the largest private residence in the history of the world ever built. meaning it's not a castle where like a whole royal family lives there or a government official. It's not the White House or anything like that. It was one man. And it wasn't even Vanderbilt. It was, I believe, one of his sons. They all got into a contest over who could build the largest home. The oldest son built his in Manhattan, which there's very little space, but he built this huge mansion. Another one moved out to Newport, Rhode Island, and built one on the beach called the Breakers, which was even larger. And then the youngest son moved to North Carolina, where land was very cheap. And the Vanderbilts controlled railroads, but they also started to build or purchase a lot of textile mills. A lot of the textile mills close in New England and they move to the South where labor is cheaper and where New England says, well, we're going to make steel and other things now because that's much more lucrative. And so North Carolina started to have in the Piedmont region and the mountain region, a lot of these factories that were doing textile mills. And all of that wealth built this huge palace, essentially. I forget all the stats. You guys can Google it. You can look it up at the Biltmore. It's today donated to I believe just the state of North Carolina controls it. It's a museum now where you can take tours of it. And it's like going to Versailles. It's bigger and better than Versailles, actually. And you can go there. You can see it took an army of residents to run the place. I think there's 4 elevators in the place, which elevators were very rare back then. Vanderbilt couldn't be bothered to walk up 4 flights of stairs. I'm going to have multiple elevators here. Multiple kitchens, I think 75 bedrooms. It took an army of people. It had a whole stable in the back full of horses and then even a racetrack so that everybody could go out and watch their own races. Extraordinary, right? Isn't America great? And then you look down here and you see a typical apartment of an Italian immigrant in the turn of the 20th century in 1900, which it looks pretty bad. There is a sink here, so there's actually running water, but this is the kitchen. Looks like a murder scene, right? I think I saw that in the first Saw movie. It's pretty scary looking. And you probably have a family of 8, 9, or 10 living in there. But this was the wealth gap, right? This was the wealth gap at the time. It was incredibly harsh. Now, in every other country in the world, particularly in Europe, where industrialization was happening, they had a very strong labor union movement. This grew out of the guilds of the Middle Ages, right? Guilds started really with blacksmiths who had a highly skilled trade. It was, hard to acquire. And some people would just try to become a blacksmith, be really bad at it, and they would sell these knockoff knives and teapots and stuff, and they would fall apart. And the people who were actually good at it got mad at that and said, we want the government to shut these people down. So you got to be in a guild. You have to pay dues to the guild. We'll give that money to, certain political campaigns. And the government has to crack down on the knockoff ones, and they have to say you can't actually be a blacksmith unless you're doing it. It's not that different than being in like the carpenters or plumbers union in America today, right? You don't want to hire somebody who doesn't know what they're doing to fix your sink because it's gonna, spring a leak and it'll be bad, and then it gives plumbers a bad name. And so unions and guilds are rather similar. It's just guilds are pre-industrial and labor's unions are afterwards. Labor unions use collective bargaining as a tool. I didn't really understand how collective bargaining worked until I went to Morocco in 2011 and saw it firsthand, and then I got it. So you go to Morocco and you go to one of these factories that makes these fine rugs, and then at the end of the tour, you're with everybody, and then at the end of the tour, they put each of you in a separate room, and then they negotiate. They start haggling, and you have no idea what the price should be, right? You're American, they think you're rich, and they want to try to rip you off, so they start real like $200 for this rug, and you bargain back and forth. Why do they put you in separate rooms? So that you don't know what your friend paid, right? You're at the end of the tour and you walk out, you're like, hey, I got this rug for 120. And they go, really? I bargained them down to 40. And you're like, what? I got ripped off. You go back and they say, all sales final. Collective bargaining is if you all were there and you say, look, we have the power of all of our dollars together. There's 20 of us. We will all buy for $60. And they'll go, okay, that's so much money. We'll go ahead and do that. You have more power bargaining collectively. Think of it. If you get hired and, the boss says, hey, well, we start with $14 an hour, and you say, I won't do it for less than 18. They said, go take a hike. There's 15 other people in the waiting room, and they'll all take a lower wage than you. But what if you didn't undercut each other? What if you were all in the same union? You elected an officer, a president, to then negotiate for you, and that president said, we won't work for less than 20, and I control all the labor in this town. Then you have power, right? You can fight back against the fat cats, the rich people. Unions never got as far in America. They've always had a bad name. And there's various reasons for this. Number one, we still have this thing in America, the Puritan work ethic. If you notice, Europeans seem kind of lazy to Americans, especially the Italians. The Italians work fewer hours per year than anybody else in the advanced world. They work about 1,600 hours a year. Americans work about 2,000 hours a year. Now, I'm a teacher. I'm actually in kind of that quasi-European category. Teachers work about 1,600 hours a year if they don't work summer school. But most Americans get about 4 or 5 weeks paid vacation, and they work about 2,000 hours a year, which is higher than everybody else. The only people even close to us are the Japanese. They work about 1,950 hours a year. Argentina is very low. Germany is very low. France is very low. Everybody gets, 8 weeks of paid vacation. And so this is why when you go to Paris in August, there are no Parisians there. They're all in Yosemite or wherever else they are. They go on vacation and they're getting paid to do it. They have universal health care. They're a society that's very different, right? If you ever go to France or anywhere in Europe for that matter, they're not a service-oriented society, meaning that Americans get annoyed because you're trying to track down your waiter and your waiter's off having a cigarette with his buddy at the bus stop, just chatting. And you're like, dude, can I get my drink order at least? It'll take you 45 minutes to get a drink order. They take your actual food order 90 minutes into the meal. You're eating 2.5 hours, into the meal. And then, God help you to try to get the check. Also, you have to flag down your waiter. In America, it's service oriented. We want to turn those tables to get more people to eat per hour, right? Usually, family of 4 can get a table, sit down, eat, and leave, pay the bill within an hour, 50 minutes usually. In fact, it's funny. My mother's one of those people who that's how she grades a restaurant. It's not even the quality of the food or the ambiance or anything like that. It's how fast your food comes out and how good the service is. And they're like, oh, I want a drink refill. And then I also want a dessert. And could you bring back the salad without croutons in it? And if they could do that quickly, that's a good restaurant. In Europe, they roll their eyes at you if you want that. This is because there is a waiters union, basically. They're paid very, very good wages. So they don't care if you tip them or not. In fact, you don't really tip in those societies. When I went to France, I was shocked. They're like, oh yeah, if your meal's 21.30 euros, just round it up to 22. That's it. You just give them a couple of pieces of change because they're making $18, $19, $20 an hour anyway. In America, there are states like Mississippi that have actually petitioned the government there to be able to not pay their workers. Technically, they do get a wage, but it's below minimum wage. It's $3 an hour. And then the government takes 100% of their income as taxes. They tax their tips from their actual income. So their take-home check is zero. I've been to Mississippi and I knew this. So we always tipped very, very well. It's just a different culture in America. It's very, very different. We want businesses to be open every day. I was at the grocery store yesterday and I was looking at their holiday hours and their Ralph's is open till 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I'm like, who the hell is shopping at 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve? Get your act together, buddy. Go shopping the week before. Give those people a break. We don't have this attitude. It's about convenience. It's about what I want. It's about, I want to walk into a 7-Eleven at 2 a.m. and be able to buy whatever I want. Go to Europe. Most things are closed. On a weekday, almost everything closes down at about 5 p.m. On a Friday, if you're in Europe, nothing is open except for restaurants and bars. That's it. Everything, all that stuff is closed. They just go spend time with your family, right? I don't know if we hate our families in America or what it is, but we want convenience. We want to be able to go out on Christmas Day and see a movie. It's like, do you hate your family? Just spend time with one day, just stay home all day and spend time with your family. No one's doing it this year because of the pandemic, but it's an interesting phenomenon how we're very different. Labor unions have this attitude in America where people believe that it's because people are lazy, they don't want to do work, or it's these no good immigrants that come in. My granddaddy worked and scratched and clawed and worked his way to the top. He didn't have a labor union, just do your job. Labor unions have always been disproportionately immigrant in America because the working class is always disproportionately immigrant. And so labor unions never got that far in America. Today, 9% of the US labor force is unionized. And most of those are public sector jobs or government jobs. Who are the labor unions now? Teachers, police, other government employees like firefighters, stuff like that. But in the private sector, really, it's only the truck drivers and the longshoremen. That's it, the stevedores. They're in the Teamsters Union. That's it. There used to be, in the 1940s and 50s in this country, 35%, 1 out of every 3 workers belonged to a labor union. And so what did that mean? This great compression that it's known as, where labor unions get strong and they boost wages, And then labor unions also control political parties. So there's heavy taxes on the rich. And so the rich aren't as rich and the poor aren't as poor. If you notice, inequality was the lowest in America in the 1950s and 60s. If you like that, if you don't care, then I guess you don't care. But inequality is off the chart now because labor unions are very weak. They were even weaker in the late 19th century. Only 3% of the US workforce was unionized. So we'll talk about those few labor unions. Labor union movement was very strong, particularly in Germany, of all places. Germany had a very strong labor union movement. And so they are a lot more understanding of this, right? Like one thing that really annoys Americans is when we go on holiday in France, not only the waiting service, but just someone's always on strike. I've been to Paris 3 times. First time I went, the bus drivers were on strike. Second time I went, the metro workers were on strike, the subway workers. Third time, the actual waiters were on strike. So we had to just get fast food when we were there that time. Go to grocery stores and just, buy like piece of cheese and some meat and stuff like that. And Americans always complain at this. It's inconvenient, right? I can't use, the metro. The feeling in those countries is solidarity with the workers. I'm not going to ride in the metro, right? America has a culture that's a lot more individualistic, I would say. Some people would say selfish. Look at our debates about masks. I don't want to wear a mask. It's like, well, it's not for you. It's really for everyone else, right? Masks are actually much more effective at stopping you breathing germs out to other people, not the other way around. But, in America, we don't want to stop people from doing what they're doing because individual freedom is kind of the highest value we have, and not these ideas of like collective bargaining and the collective good of workers. We just don't care about that as much. Just work hard individually and improve your life on your own. That's that Puritan work ethic that America has. In any case, unions still do emerge. There had been a few here and there in the early 19th century, but in the Gilded Age, you'll have a few that become rather large. The first would be the Knights of Labor. The second would be the AFL. Now, we're going to kind of do a compare contrast. So the Knights of Labor is the more inclusive of the two. It took people that were foreign born and native born. It took women as well as men. It took black as well as white. It took Jew as well as Gentile. And they took skilled as well as unskilled, which was a big discriminatory phenomenon as well. AFL was the more exclusive one. The AFL was typically workers who had semi-skilled or skilled labor. This would be carpenters, plumbers, people like that, machinists. Like that picture I showed you, a slide or two back. Yeah, this one, like the woman working on this machine, this loom, is unskilled, but the guy who comes in and fixes it when it breaks down, that would be a skilled job. AFL basically felt, look, I am special, right? I'm a WASPy Protestant. My family's lived in America for 10 generations, and we need to protect our own jobs and our own wages. Everybody else who's unskilled or black or Jewish or, whatever, screw them. We don't want to associate with them. In fact, they're driving down my wages. And so the AFL, founded by Samuel Gompers, and if any of you have ever went to Gompers Elementary, that was him. He was president of the AFL. American Federation of Labor, and they were very exclusive and very discriminatory. But they did wonderful things for the workers who were able to join. They improved their lot in life. They petitioned government to do a lot, some of it very bad. It was the AFL who came up with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s because they felt Chinese labor was driving down wages and they didn't want to compete with it. And so they got the government to change their immigration law. The Knights of Labor was the one that was inclusive. They took everybody. The other big difference was that the Knights of Labor were quite radical. If you actually look at their charter, they were anarchist. Anarchism is sort of a close relative to communism and socialism. Communism and socialism essentially says that capitalism is this terrible system that's doomed to failure and that there will eventually be this revolution and the workers will take over the factories. And then government will run everything. There'll be no private business. And the anarchists say, no, government is also a problem. Government can oppress just as surely as private business. In fact, if you look, there's this rather interesting turnstile system where people go from CEO of a corporation to being Secretary of the Treasury and then back. Look at who it is right now, right? Steve Mnuchin, who came straight out of Goldman Sachs, the richest and wealthiest investment bank in the world, and then he becomes our Secretary of Treasury, and then he'll go right back. Look at our first Secretary of State under Donald Trump was Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil. It's rather interesting that this is what happens, and anarchists look at that and say it's this cozy relationship between the two, that the bourgeoisie, the rich ruling class, controls everything. They control government and business. So why would you think if the government took over it'd be any different? We need to get rid of all forms of control. So anarchists had this rather crazy notion that one day the workers would take over and labor unions would run it all. It wouldn't be government and it wouldn't be business. Those would be both abolished. And then labor unions, which would be highly democratic, much more than our own constitution, and they would run it all, and it would be this wonderful paradise. Well, it was kind of a ridiculous pipe dream that they had, but nonetheless, they changed a lot, and they did wonderful things for their workers. But they were openly revolutionary. I mean, in their charter, they're saying, we're going to take over every industry. There'll be a Knights of Labor lumberjack union and a Knights of Labor steel mill union and a Knights of Labor mining union. And soon we'll just branch out and take over every worker in America will be in the Knights of Labor. And then one day we'll just take over all the means of production, tell the bosses to take a hike, and all the soldiers will be in the Knights of Labor, so they'll take over the government and we'll live in a paradise. This was terrifying for the rich and for the middle classes in America. They did not like this. The AFL offered an alternative. They said, look, these crazy lunatics over here want a revolution. We just want bread and butter, simple things. We don't want to overthrow the wage system or capitalism. We just want better wages and shorter hours and safer working conditions, and that's it. And so you had this dichotomy of the two. Now, what you will notice happening is the AFL will stay with us. It still is today the largest labor union in the country. It is merged with the CIO, which doesn't exist at this time in the 1890s. It'll come around in the 1930s, but they merged the AFL-CIO, it's known as now. Knights of Labor disappeared. What happened to them? Well, in 1886, on May 4th, there was a very violent uprising in Haymarket Square in Chicago. So basically, here's what happened. If you guys are unaware of this, I think I mentioned this to you in the first week of school, right? Labor Day is what we celebrate. Everyone else in the world celebrates May Day. Some countries celebrate May Week, where you get a whole week off for the socialist labor unions, which are a huge, right, force in most of these countries. Look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, which is the country that is most like us. 35% of their workforce is unionized today. So, you know, their country's much more socialistic. And for good or bad, some people think that's a dirty word, some people don't. It doesn't really matter, but the value you put on it. But the point is, when you have more labor unions, that means you typically have higher taxes on the rich and more social services for the poor and for the working class and even for the middle class. And they celebrate May Day and May Week. Workers get, you know, a few days off of work. In America, we didn't have a national holiday in the 1890s for May Day and May Week, but some cities did. And it came from the socialists and communists and anarchists. They say, hey, we work hard. We built this country just as surely as Rockefeller did. Rockefeller, you know, used his ingenuity and technology, but he couldn't have done it without workers building all the wealth for him. And so we deserve time off too, and we deserve a living wage, and we deserve this and that. As America gets richer, we deserve a piece of the pie. So they negotiated to get a week off. All workers did. And they had these huge celebrations. People were out there in Haymarket Square, you know, selling their products and, you know, marching and passing out pamphlets. How can we, you know, improve the workers? And during the celebration, a bomb went off, killing dozens of people. They weren't really sure who was responsible, but they decided to blame it on the Knights of Labor. It turns out it probably was a few radical members of the Knights who wanted to start doing radical stuff like bombing and terrorizing people and fomenting revolution. And this led to their utter destruction. The Chicago police, the US government, everybody went after the Knights of Labor and arrested their leadership and sentenced them to long prison sentences after Haymarket Square. Because it was very easy to point to them and say, these anarchists are murdering little children in public. They're terrorists. And so this completely destroyed the Knights of Labor. They would not go away forever. There was always a need for working class people in these unskilled jobs to then join unions and do better. And so you'll see in 1905, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, comes out, and they grow to be very big, and then they'll be snuffed out of existence during World War I, and then they'll reemerge again as the CIO, and then they'll finally merge with the AFL. But those are the two basic differences. If you were in these labor unions, you got things much sooner than everybody else did. If you were in the AFL or the Knights of Labor, you got the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, the 5-day work week with weekends. Notice that Saturday is not important to Christians in a Christian calendar. Sunday is, but Saturday is just another day of the week. It was labor union people who invented this concept of Sunday, the holy day, and the day right attached to it, Saturday, would be off limits. You don't work those days. You spend time with your family. And you don't work 14, 16 hours a day. You work 8 hours a day. That there had to be a rhythm of life, right? 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure time every day that you work, and then 2 days just completely off. It was revolutionary and much more humane. Life expectancy among these workers would go up, etc. It was great, and we owe it to labor unions that gave us that stuff. Businesses wouldn't have done it on their own because businesses have to look at the bottom line. They have to look at profits. So let's talk about the industrial city. Along with industrialization necessarily come two other things. Urbanization, meaning cities are going to get big because factories necessarily have to have big populations of people coming in. Farming doesn't, but this does. And in America, it meant emigration because we just did not have enough people in the country to keep up with how fast the economy was growing and how many jobs were available. We constantly had labor shortages. So ironically, even without labor unions, wages were higher in America than they were in Europe, which is why so many people left. So many poor Italians and Germans and Poles and Jews and Russians poured into America during this time period because they could make more money here even out of a labor union than they could in Europe, because they were overpopulated there. Between 1870 and 1910, this is the most intense period of immigration in our history. 20 million immigrants came to the US at a rate of 1,250 per day, which is just astonishing when you think about it. This is the age of Ellis Island, right? Is that your Statue of Liberty is gifted to us in 1876. It goes up, it's right next to Ellis Island, and immigrants know they're in America when they see the Statue of Liberty. Then they're processed through Ellis Island and they come into the country. Some stay in New York, some get on a train and go elsewhere. But US was a nation of immigrants. Other than probably Budapest and Vienna, New York was probably the most diverse city on earth at this particular time. It was a very rare thing to walk down a street and hear a different language on every block. It was very normal in New York to say, this block they speak Yiddish, this block they speak Italian, this block they're speaking Gaelic because they're from Ireland, Croatian here, Bosnian here, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that is exciting to many liberals, but to many conservatives, it was like New York's a foreign country within, or a foreign city within the US itself. And a lot of Americans think that way today. If you guys are unaware of this, big cities like LA and New York, they have sort of a love-hate relationship. Americans love to turn on TV and watch their favorite shows, but then they make fun of Hollywood, right? It's this weird place where all these bizarre people live, right? Same thing with New York. People are like, oh, it's filthy, it's disgusting, I hate it. Too many homeless people and, too many immigrants, nobody speaks English, et cetera, et cetera. But everybody still dreams of going to New York to watch Hamilton on Broadway or, see Times Square or the Statue of Liberty or whatever. And so this starts essentially in the late 19th century. I mean, it had going on before then, but really this is the time period where you get the New York City that we know today. This time around, the immigrants are not coming from Northwestern Europe. It's not Irish and German. The majority of immigrants are coming from Southeastern Europe. And so these new immigrants are very, very exotic to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. None are Protestant, hardly at all. Most are either Catholic, Eastern Orthodox Christian, or Jewish. And that is very, very exotic to most waspy Protestants. Many people thought they could never be assimilated, but they are, and these people thrive in America. This is the subway tunnel, little rendering of it, which the Italians built. New York does not build the first subway system in the world. It's actually, oh, I'm just blanked on it. Was it Budapest? I believe so. Yeah, Budapest, Hungary, because again, I mentioned that before. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was very diverse. There were 15 ethnicities within this empire, and you could move within the empire. The US was probably more diverse because we had European peoples, but also people from Asia, native-born people, etc. London was not diverse at this time. Neither was Paris, neither was Berlin. Vienna was, Prague was, Budapest was. London builds the second subway system. New York builds the third. It opens in 1902, as you can see here. And it was extraordinary. For 5 cents, you could travel anywhere within New York City. So the poor now could get out of the overcrowded city and go to other places for leisure. It was wonderful. But the immigrant experience and makeup is uniquely American. Make sure that you understand that. That seemed bizarre to most other peoples, but in America, we were a nation of immigrants for sure, and cities were disproportionately that way. Just like today, if you live in Long Beach, it's very diverse, lots of immigrants. If you go to Iowa, it's all white, native-born people, mostly, pretty much. And those trends start in the late 19th century. Okay, we don't need to go over the Brooklyn Bridge or the subway or anything like that, but cities were becoming more livable. Suspension bridges that allowed people to traverse, the river used to go on, ferry boats across the bridge. Now you could walk or take a trolley car across the bridge. It was much quicker. You could take the subway. There were now sanitation. So everyone had a flushing toilet and a sink in their home, even the poorest people by 1895. Electric trolleys start to replace horses so you don't have animal waste. Cities started to become cleaner. And by 1900, they were safer and better places to live than the countryside. By the 1920s, people have refrigerators in their homes. People are born in hospitals. People have electric lighting. They have gas stoves, etc. All of this made cities better places with higher life expectancy than the countryside. So there's a flip-flop that will happen right at the turn of the 20th century. Cities were growing and they were becoming more livable. Now, with better life expectancy, with better wages through labor unions, the middle class now had a savings which they could spend on things other than just sustenance. And so there were big worries over, do we just let people buy whatever they want? Because human beings are human beings and they're going to buy the most base things. Okay, so big fears that Americans would use all their money to buy liquor, pornography, prostitution, and therefore we had to regulate vice. So Edison was on board with this. He monopolized and controlled all, because he controlled the invention of the movie production camera. He was only going to show movies that were wholesome. And it finally took basically mafioso types that found, copies of these cameras and these projectors to start showing, black market versions of their own movies. That finally broke down this monopoly, and people enjoyed spending money on these racier kind of movies, not by our own standards, but, movies about train robberies and, girls would like hike their skirts up to their knee to get a ride on a wagon. And it was like, ooh, wow, that's kind of shocking. It's the Victorian age. So, you got to cut people some slack there. I love this picture. This is a picture of 3 women at the beach at Coney Island in the 1890s. And they're just in their full-blown dresses, just like they must sink to the bottom of the water, I guess. Women didn't show very much skin in public. You couldn't really do that until really the 1920s is when women kind of started wearing modern swimsuits, and it was more acceptable to do that. We moved out of the Victorian era by that time. But leisure was something that now you could do. Life was a bit fun during this time period, at least for the middle class. You had weekends off. You could now, for a nickel a piece, you could ride on the subway with your whole family, get out of Midtown Manhattan and get out to Coney Island. Coney Island is in South Brooklyn, and they import a lot of sand to make an artificial beach there. And they had the world's first roller coaster there. It was the first theme park ever built in America. I forget the exact year, but I think it opened in the late 1880s, early 1890s. If you've seen Spider-Man Homecoming, it's where he has his great battle with Vulture at the end, right? He's, tussling with him on the beach there. And if you don't know New York geography, you don't understand that. But that's where that is. That's Coney Island. If you ever watch, one of my favorite things ever to do is on the 4th of July, I watched the Nathan's hot dog eating competition. If you know what I'm talking about, you're like, oh yeah, Joey Chestnut, he's amazing. By the way, I love it. If you look on YouTube right now, you can pause this lecture and check it out. Look for the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Championship. My favorite thing about it, because it's so gross, it's unbelievable. In 15 minutes, guys and now women because we're living in an age of, feminism and women's equality. You can take part in this grotesque exercise as well. They have a competition where they try to eat as many hot dogs as they can in 15 minutes. They do this at Coney Island, right on the boardwalk. It's one of these things on my bucket list. I got to go to the 4th of July in Brooklyn at some point and see this spectacle, because it's so American, right? That's what I do on the 4th of July to celebrate independence. I will make myself sick off of hot dogs. Joey Chestnut has the record. I think he ate 74 hot dogs in 15 minutes at one point with the buns. It's gross. But this is the first amusement park. It just starts first with the beach, and then they built a roller coaster. The first roller coaster was actually designed to replicate a minecart experience, right? As people would read in New York about immigrants in Colorado working in the coal mines. And so they built it to be like an out-of-control mine car going down the tracks. That was the first roller coaster. And then they had a carousel, and they had those little games where you squirt water into the clown's mouth and it blows up the balloon. And then they had like a penny arcade where you go in and you could play various games, the whack-a-mole and stuff like that. They had Nickelodeons. If you don't know what those are, not the channel, but an actual Nickelodeon, as you pop a nickel into this little device. They have them at Disneyland if you go on Main. In fact, all of Main Street, Disneyland, is mocked up to look like Coney Island circa 1900, basically. The girls all have the long dresses. The guys have those weird outfits with like the straw hats and the armbands and stuff and the suspenders. Very much that's what it's supposed to be. Disneyland was one of the very first theme parks on the West Coast, and Walt wanted to make it kind of, at least part of it, look like Coney Island in the 1890s. And the music is all that music, that ragtime music from the era, which was brand new and very exciting. So this was fun stuff. You could go on a date with your sweetheart. You go for a little swim in the ocean, walk along the boardwalk, hold hands, view the Nickelodeon. You go up to the visor and you look into it and you crank the handle, and it's just a series of pictures that kind of scroll past. So it's like a movie, basically. You could do all that stuff there. Buy a hot dog from a vendor, buy a bag of peanuts and Cracker Jack. Cracker Jack is a very old-timey kind of food. I don't think anybody under 100 eats it. But this was the very first, and it was like, this is cool, this is fun, and now it starts to spread everywhere. The middle class started to develop kind of their own culture. They sort of said, all right, well, we all are clerks and lawyers and doctors who work in offices, so we have to actually get exercise. If you're an immigrant who works at the dock, you don't need to go to the gym on weekends. So you don't need to exercise, right? If you sit in an office all day, you very much do. And so nobody had gym memberships or, anything like that back then. And so the idea was, if you're middle class, you need to get out of the office and get back to nature. You need to go hiking. You need to go camping. You need to go ice skating. You need to go bicycling. The bicycle comes out of this time period, right? The one with the big wheel in the front, the small one in the back, and then they get better and better in the future. Baseball is popularized during this time. It had existed for decades, but now it was like, we'll join a league. If you are a teacher, then all the teachers at your school will form a team, and then you'll play, the accountants from the other side of the tracks, or the barrel makers in town will challenge the police, etc. And you had all these amateur leagues playing baseball to get out one day a week to nature and play. The major leagues coming out this time. The first professional team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, 1869. And every year students are like, if there was only one professional team, who did they play? Well, they played all the amateur teams, and they destroyed them. There was a lot of resistance to having pro baseball. Everybody thought it would destroy the sport. And in some ways it kind of did, because it's corrupt and everybody wants to win. So everybody's taking steroids and cheating. I'm talking about you, Astros. And in some ways it's ruined the purity of the sport. Many people just said, I will never watch a game where people are paid to play. You're supposed to do it for the love of the sport and for recreation, and for those reasons. But they figured that if you could quit your full-time job and just play baseball full-time, you could get really good. And so they did. Some people thought it was bizarre, because out of all the players on their team, out of a 21-person squad, 20 of them were from other cities. Only one guy was from Cincinnati. And they said, well, these guys don't even represent our team. You guys ever think it's weird that we root for our team? It's like, go Dodgers, they're the best. And I love the Dodgers. How many of those guys are actually from LA? 3 of them, maybe. I know Justin Turner's from Long Beach. I don't think any of the rest of those guys are. So who artificially decided that they would represent Los Angeles, right? It's kind of a bizarre thing. It's just the city tells you, this is your team. Oh, okay, I'm loyal to my team. It's kind of weird. Many people thought that would never catch on. It caught on. People paid a nickel or a dime to get in to see the Red Stockings play other teams. And so almost immediately in the 1870s, copycat teams start to emerge, and every major American city had a team, and this was something people did. There was no American football yet. There was no hockey yet. There was no soccer existed, but it was invented in Britain and then spread around the world, but we had already had independence, so we never really caught on with soccer. A little bit, MLS, but not that much. These other sports, invented in America catch on very, very well. And now we have pro sports, which is a huge part of our leisure and a huge part of our cultural existence. And we constantly debate about it, should athletes bring politics in, right? Where we take a knee during the national anthem, or we, protest this or that. A lot of people don't like that. Get politics out of my game. Other people say, no, it's part of American life like everything else. But sports is a huge reflection of American culture, enormous. Education. It used to be you just had 1st through 6th grade. New England started this. Boston had the first one. It spread all throughout the North. After the Civil War, the South is going to have 1st through 6th. And then New England started to say, the economy is getting complex. We need more years. So then they took it up to 8 years. And it was German immigrants who actually wound back the clock a year and said, 6 years old is too late to start. We're going to start at 5 and call it kindergarten, right? You guys ever wonder why kindergarten is such a weird looking and spelled word? It's because it's German. Okay, kindergarten literally means child's garden. And it was German immigrants who developed that. And they developed the first bilingual program in America where you would do English in the morning and German in the afternoon. So German immigrants could kind of maintain that cultural tie to the old country. After they did that, then WASPy Protestants said, what a brilliant idea. We're going to wind back the clock and go to 5 years old as well. And we'll have K through 8th. Then New England in the early 20th century started going to high school. Now, very few people, only about 3%, it says here, by 1900 of Americans went to a district where you had all the way through 12th grade. Starts in New England, but by the 1930s, everyone in the country has a K through 12 education. We haven't changed it since then, at least the free part, right? You can go on with your education after it, but then it starts to get very expensive. One thing Bernie Sanders said is that this is just a natural evolution. There was a time when we had no public schools, then we had 1st through 6th, then we added K, then we added through 12th, and now we need to go through college and pay it with tax funder supported money. Whatever you think about that, that's one argument, but it at least has a historical foundation that one could argue. So that's essentially what's going on at this point. I wanted to talk about social Darwinism because it's really important, but I've gone on too long at this point. I'll add it into the next lecture. I want to leave you with one thing. I'll play a little song for you guys because I mentioned ragtime. This was music that came out of New Orleans. It's pre-jazz. Jazz is not really around till the 19-teens, and especially the 20s is when it really explodes, when African Americans move from New Orleans to New York and can record their own music. But it had its roots in ragtime, so I'll play you a very famous ragtime song here. I'm sure all of you have heard this. This song was written and recorded in 1902, and it was recorded by an African-American gentleman named Scott Joplin, and it is known as The Entertainer. Those of you in band, you probably know how to play it, but I'll go ahead and cue it up here on YouTube so you can hear it. Sorry, I got a commercial. Okay. And another commercial. Gotta watch 2 of them now. Generous. Welcome. Okay, so here we go. I'll share my screen with you. Here it goes. Okay, and then it just repeats after that. But I'm 100% of you had to have heard that song before. If cartoons or learning music, it's a very, very popular American song. I love it, and I love that this is an era where Jim Crow racism was at its absolute peak, and yet an African American man was able to achieve some measure of success, write music, and white people were listening to this and dancing to it. So this is sort of what I would call popularized or commercialized fun. People had fun before, but it was like with your family, you sat around the fire and dad would get the fiddle out and play and you'd sing. But there's no way to really record music. Now, this was not recorded until later. It's written in 1902, but it was just sheet music that you would buy, and men and women would play it on a player piano or whatever in public. Music's not able to be recorded till about World War I, about 1917, 1918. Yet still, this was mass produced as sheet music, and people heard it everywhere. Ball games, etc. Big corporations, you're paying them to entertain you. Vaudeville, this big traveling circus, essentially, you would go and buy a ticket, and it would go to every major American city. So this is the new emerging America that was going on, and industrialization spurred this kind of commercialized fun, which is nice that people could now pay money and be entertained. Life is long, and the drudgery of work every day, you need something as a creative outlet, and this provided. Okay, excuse me. So I will see you guys next time. Take care and have fun. Stay safe. Bye-bye.